A cognitive bias is a systemic error in thinking that affects the decisions and judgments that people make when they are processing information about the world around them. The concept was introduced in 1972 by two social science researchers named Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. In the decades since then, researchers have identified hundreds of cognitive biases. We like to think that we are always rational and logical, but in truth, everyone has cognitive biases. The human brain is a powerful processor, but still has limitations. Cognitive biases are the result of the brain's attempt to circumvent those processing limitations. Heuristics, in the context of cognitive bias, can be thought of as mental shortcuts. These help the brain be efficient when managing all of the stimuli and information the world bombards us with. In a sense, they are the algorithms of the human brain, designed to detect patterns to solve problems. Heuristics can be helpful, but they can also lead to the faulty thinking of cognitive biases. Other factors that help create cognitive bias include emotion, individual motivations, and social pressures. There are hundreds of cognitive biases, so let's take a look at a few. The anchoring bias identifies the fact that we tend to depend too heavily on a new piece of information offered than any subsequent information during decision making. An example of anchoring bias can be seen in salary negotiations. The first number stated becomes the anchoring point for all negotiations, but it doesn't only apply to numbers. For example, doctors can be susceptible, allowing their first impression of a patient to create an anchoring point that influences the diagnostic assessments they request. Another bias is the fundamental attribution error. This describes how people will say their negative behavior was caused by a situation, but for another person, it was a fundamental personality trait that caused the same negative behavior. For example, they might say, "I was late because of traffic," but when a coworker is late, it's because they're lazy. The group attribution error is another cognitive bias that refers to people's tendency to believe that the attributes of an individual reflect the characteristics of the groups they belong to. For example, just because a team has made a decision, don't assume that everyone agrees. Another bias is the false consensus effect, which describes the tendency to overestimate how normal our values and ideas are and overestimate how much other people agree with us. It is strongest when we feel an issue is important, confident in our point of view, or convinced of the absolute moral rightness of the idea. So, if a person is 100% certain that the environment is being irrevocably damaged by humans burning fossil fuels, the false consensus effect will cause them to believe that the majority of people agree with them. Finally, let's talk about optimism bias, which has two parts. First, it is the belief that our individual chances of experiencing something negative are lower than the people around us. It's also called the illusion of invulnerability. The optimism bias makes us believe our chances of experiencing something positive are higher than our peers. This causes us to be unrealistic in our expectations of success. In some instances, cognitive biases can be helpful. For example, the optimism bias can lead to a sense of anticipation about the future, which you believe to be full of good things. But they can also allow people to be manipulated. Salesmen use the anchoring bias when they name a high price as their first offer in a negotiation because they know you will move your offer closer to that anchor, even if you have a much lower starting point in mind. And they can also lead to major problems for individuals or groups. For instance, the optimism bias can lead people to take risks with their health, such as not wearing a seatbelt or smoking because they believe they aren't going to get hurt or get sick. And the group attribution bias and the false consensus effect can work to support the creation of stereotypes. For example, when the media portrays negative images of marginalized communities, the group attribution effect causes people to believe and assume all members of that community fit the negative stereotype portrayed. And the false consensus effect amplifies the stereotype by suggesting that the majority of people share those opinions. It is very important for us to be aware of these biases and to take concrete steps to overcome their impacts. Look for ways to challenge what you think you see. Seek out information from a range of sources. Discuss your thoughts with others. Surround yourself with a diverse group of people, and don't be afraid to listen to dissenting views. Reflect on your decision-making history and think about whether you've rushed to judgment in the past. You have learned about cognitive bias and several examples pertaining to this broad bias. Remember to reflect on these examples that present themselves in your everyday life and how they impact your work as an AI ethicist.